Welcome to Dreams of History. Imagine, if you will, a night so quiet it feels as if the world is holding its breath. A darkness so deep the stars themselves seem to lean closer to listen. In that hush there were once voices that spoke not as poets, but as astronomers, priests, and rulers. And these voices carved into clay and stone a warning that the centuries tried to bury. Tonight, I will take you along those ancient lines where myth brushes history, where prophecy is cataloged in the same clay that counted kings and seasons, where the name they whispered in secret Nibiru was both a scientific observation and a threat that altered empires. Listen slowly. The truth is patient and sometimes must be felt more than understood. Long before telescopes and satellites, before modern orbits were charted, there were careful watchers of the sky who tracked a body that returned in patterns, in pulses, in cycles. They did not have our vocabulary, but they had detailed records, repeated references to a returning celestial visitor. A crossing body that altered tides, shifted the sky, and carried with it storms of fire and dust. They described, in their symbols and poems, a planet that appeared like a second sun, like a judgment, like a visitor whose path was not welcome. These were not the idle myths of a people trying to explain thunder. These were sustained chronicles, scrawled into clay tablets by scribes whose lives were devoted to the calendar. The Sumerian tablets, some of the oldest written records humanity preserved, speak of heavens with paths not wholly unlike the elliptical orbits we later described with mathematics. They listed kings who reigned astonishingly long lineages that expanded with numbers we struggle to parse, and revolutions of the heavens tied to the fate of cities. Among these entries were not only names and taxes and rituals, but careful, sometimes clinical descriptions of a body whose return coincided with catastrophe, floods that did not recede, storms that changed coasts, nights when stars dimmed and a great light crossed the sky. To understand why kings feared this body, imagine being a ruler whose legitimacy depends on the stability of the seasons and the fidelity of gods. If the sky itself becomes a variable that cannot be controlled, your power unravels. So the rulers did something that would echo through millennia. They buried the details. They purified libraries, edited chronicles, ordered tablets recarved. These acts were not only administrative, they were acts of fear. Kings premised their reigns on order, on the promise that the harvests would return and the river would not rise in unexpected fury. To admit the existence of a celestial agent that could unpredictably reorder coasts and climates was to admit the fragility of their power. So there arose a clandestine effort to erase, to obfuscate, to take the names of certain sky events off the public record. But clay is stubborn in ways stone is not. Sometimes tablets survive in dumps and foundations. Sometimes scribes hide notes in marginalia. And stories persist in the cadence of songs sung by fishermen who remember a night when the lamp of the harbor failed and the sea turned to a mirror of fire. Across cultures, from the river valleys to the temple hills, there are echo stories of a great passing, of a world that touched and changed another. The Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, are mentioned in several of these traditions, sometimes as progenitors, sometimes as engineers, sometimes as gods whose presence precipitated change. Whether one interprets them as literal visitors or as metaphors for cometary events, the recurrence is striking. A consistent narrative of an external celestial influence that arrivals in cycles. A narrative that bears on natural harmony across independent cultures. As I tell this, think not in absolutes but in patterns. This is the domain where myth and proto-science converge. The Sumerian scribes were early scientists in their way. They numbered and compared and noticed repetition. They recorded intervals that correspond intriguingly to multiples of thousands of years. Later cultures encoded similar myths: the Mayan long counts, the flood stories, the cyclical destructions. Some modern theorists label this whole web as conspiracy. Others call it coincidence. But when you lay the fragments together, you begin to discern a lattice of recurring observation. What did the kings do? They burned some scrolls, they recarved names, they buried maps. A few trusted priests maintained hidden archives, carved inscriptions deep within temple walls. Tablets secreted in foundation stones. The reason was simple and brutal. Knowledge of the pattern undermined the myth of chosenness. If people knew the sky could fall in predictable cycles, they would not sustain the cult of an immortal ruler who promised perpetual security. Power depends on the illusion of permanence. So archaeologists, when they unearth a rubble mound, sometimes find not only pottery shards, but those marginal notes that the official copyists missed. A scribal hand, hurried, perhaps embarrassed, may have left a line like a living whisper. When the red star crosses, the rivers will climb. Those are the lines we chase. The tablets themselves are curious things, rectangular, baked, fragile, and yet remarkably resistant to time. Their inscriptions are succinct, not in the elaborately rhetorical style of later epics, but direct, noting positions and omens. One tablet, catalogued quietly in a museum back room, notes anomalous solar brightness for several nights, and then a notation of a guest that returns after many years. Another lists the destruction of a city, followed by the gift of stars, which may be how an ancient chronicler described a comet's debris raining like gifts, but also bringing ruin. When modern astronomers began to model distant perturbations in the solar system, the term Planet 9 entered technical literature, a hypothesized massive object influencing the orbits of icy bodies in the outer reaches. That modern calculus, driven by observations of small, frozen worldlets tugging awkwardly in their paths, seems almost a new voice echoing an old chorus. Could ancient watchers have been noticing a pattern we are only now beginning to quantify with telescopes? This is the more cautious version of the puzzle. But the more charged version is the one that kings feared. Supposing a crossing body with a long, eccentric orbit, one that visits the inner solar system sporadically in eras separated by thousands of years. Suppose, too, that such a passage could, due to gravitational disturbances or associated cometary debris, alter climate and coastlines, trigger volcanic unrest, and reshape human habitation. Suppose furthermore that it had psychological and socio-political consequences, panic, migration, and that the rulers who could not protect their people would find their authority crumbling. If that seems dramatic, remember that natural events in recorded history have precipitated social collapse. The Late Bronze Age saw the unraveling of multiple complex societies within a relatively brief span. And while multiple factors contributed, drought, migration, war, and astronomical component remains theorized by some. It is not necessary to claim that Nibiru is the sole or even primary cause of anything. It is to say that the evidence suggests a correlation worth taking seriously. Consider the symbolic measures rulers used to erase the memory. Temples renovated with new inscriptions that replaced older lines. Religious reforms that recast celestial events as metaphors of purification. And bureaucratic retconning, where the chroniclers created alternate etiologies for the same events. Imagine a scribe sitting in a dim room, chisel in hand, instructed to replace guest star with divine favor so the narrative would flatter the throne. It is in those substitutions that we find traces of a political history of denial. Yet denial never completely succeeds because built landscapes remember. Foundations of temples sometimes contain reused tablets. Palaces built atop earlier palaces occasionally preserve older inscriptions in their lower walls. When modern archaeologists peel back strata, they sometimes stumble upon inconsistent narratives, signs that older stories were overwritten. Those palimpsests are revelations. They point to an active process of cultural memory being manipulated, and in the cracks we find the story of the forbidden planet. From a scientific standpoint, the challenges are obvious. Orbital mechanics demands a mass and orbit consistent with the observed perturbations. Ephemeral, low-mass visitors cannot produce the gravitational signature needed to explain certain long-period anomalies. So if their Azor was such a body, it must meet constraints that are stringent, sufficiently massive to perturb distant orbits yet shy enough in the inner system to avoid detection in recorded historical telescopes, or to have had its most noticeable approaches before precise telescopic observations. The idea has been debated in professional circles, sometimes called speculative, sometimes ridiculed. But science advances by taking anomalies seriously and testing them. The point of all this historical and scientific back and forth is not to conjure a sensational headline, but to trace how knowledge and power interact. In many ancient societies, the distinction between priest and scientist did not exist as we understand it. Astronomers served the state, and their records influenced agricultural planning, religious rites, and political legitimacy. When those records contained inconvenient truths, rulers chose censorship. Yet human curiosity persisted, transmitted through rituals and coded metaphors, even in lullabies that hinted at past terrors. The Anunnaki motif is illustrative, to some, a cultural memory of a technologically advanced group. To others, a mythic personification of natural forces. To others still, a way to reconcile recurring catastrophic events with a moral cosmology where gods test humans. The critical point is that the motif survived, reframed, but intact. Modern science and ancient metaphors sometimes converge in uncomfortable ways. Consider a tablet that mentions a twin of the sun seen at a certain season, whose approach preceded a sea rising in a way that altered a coastline. Compare that to geological evidence of abrupt coastal change in certain regions around what might be considered the Venice and of a prior warm period. There is an uneasy fit between textual anecdote and sedimentary story. That fit is not proof, but it is a pattern that should make scholars cautious about dismissal. When investigating such patterns, we must also be honest about the psychology of survivorship and narrative selection. Humans are story-making animals. They emphasize memorable events. They link them causally, sometimes erroneously. Yet when different cultures, isolated by distances and separated by oceans, produce similar images of a catastrophic sky event, the argument for a real, recurrent phenomenon strengthens. Whether that phenomenon is a comet, an errant planet, or a series of related events, the historical imprint is undeniable. Now imagine the last time this visitor passed close enough to be unmistakable. Towns would have prepared offerings, priests would have stayed awake in towers, sailors would have refused to leave port. The first nights might have been beautiful and extracelestial light dominating the firmament, drawing those unaccustomed eyes to the heavens. Then the true danger would begin. Debris showers that blackened the skies. Changes in sea behavior with unexpected tides. Storms amplified by heat differentials caused by atmospheric dust and particulate matter. Crops fail, trade routes falter, refugees move inland, political systems strain. In that maelstrom, rulers are revealed for what they are. If a king could claim a special relation to the gods that control the sky, he might survive politically. If not, he would be replaced, perhaps violently. Thus, kings had an existential reason to erase, to prevent the public from seeing a pattern that would undercut the illusion of their permanence. In the modern era, the conversation shifts from mythic power to instruments, telescopes, satellites, spectral analysis. Contemporary astronomers searching for a Planet 9 rely on mathematical signatures in the orbits of Kuiper Belt objects. They extrapolate potential orbits and masses. They search the sky with wide-field surveys, and they test hypotheses with patience. The point here is not to conflate their careful work with ancient scribal notes, but to observe that different epochs used different tools to watch the heavens. Ancient scribes left us qualitative measurements. Modern scientists can provide quantitative models. When both point toward recurrent anomalies, we owe it to history to listen and to science to test. As the night draws to a close, let us return to the human core of this story. There is beauty in the knowledge that our ancestors watched the skies with seriousness, that they took measurements in their own fashion, that they encoded fear and wonder into tablets and songs. There is also a moral in the king's efforts to erase. The urge to control narrative persists. Whether by chisel or by algorithm, knowledge suppressed tends to leak in odd corners, marginal notes, folk tales, and now, archaeological fragments. The forbidden can never be fully buried because curiosity acts as a slow geological force, exposing layers given time. So what do we do with this story now, in our era of satellites and open data? We proceed with humility. We do not replace careful science with sensationalism, nor do we dismiss ancient voices as merely poetic. We synthesize, we test, we search the archives, and we respect the warnings encoded long ago by watchers of the sky. The cosmic visitor, whatever its precise nature, served as a catalytic memory that shaped human institutions, prompted erasures, and inspired myths that survived into our own time. That is the historical truth. A single astronomical pattern can ripple outward, affecting memory, governance, and the arts. As you close your eyes, imagine those clay tablets laid out under a lamp, the scratch of reed styluses, the murmur of watchers counting nights, and the kings, who feared truth enough to try and hide it. Imagine also our scanners now, pointing into the dark, assembling data points that may one day confirm or reframe what those ancient hands recorded. Knowledge, it seems, travels in cycles too, sometimes obscured, sometimes revealed, always leaving marks on the world. Rest with that thought and with the comfort that curiosity endures in the human heart. The past whispered its warnings. Our tools can listen more clearly than ever. And so the story stretches further because history is rarely a straight line. It coils, loops, and returns like the very celestial body it tries to describe. The deeper you travel into the remnants of the old world, the more you begin to sense an uncomfortable truth. Each civilization that approached the question of the heavens did so with a mixture of reverence and terror. In Egypt, priests charted stellar movements with astonishing precision, aligning temples to stars whose paths shifted over the millennia. They, too, spoke of a wandering light that sometimes burned brighter than all the rest, a visitor that forced recalculations so delicate that even the smallest deviation would throw entire calendars into question. Their temples contained carvings of celestial discs surrounded by serpents of fire. Metaphors, perhaps, or memories of luminous objects that seemed alive. When these objects vanished again into the void, they left behind reforms, new rituals, and sometimes abrupt cultural changes explained later as divine mandates, but rooted, perhaps, in astronomical disruption. Further west, on the high plateaus where the winds speak in low, constant tones, ancient peoples etched spirals and intersecting lines into stone, marking movements of the sky that seem obsessive until you understand their context. These cultures depended on reading the heavens not out of idle curiosity, but to predict seasons, migrations, and survival itself. When their records show interruption, a missing cycle, an extra light, an unexpected shadow, those disruptions reverberate through their stories, encoded as gods at war, suns dying and reborn, worlds turning upside down. The consistency of these disruptions across distant continents is unsettling, for it implies that the anomaly was not local. Something brightened or darkened the heavens, across a span wide enough to unite mythologies that never exchanged a single word in quieter moments. Imagine a lone astronomer on a rooftop millennia ago, looking at a sky less polluted than ours, a sky dripping with stars. Imagine him charting a feint he has seen only in the whispered memories of elders. Each night he marks its position, noticing the subtle change. The dot becomes a smudge, then a spark, then a thing with presence and weight. He feels excitement, but also dread, because knowledge without context is frightening. A returning visitor implies cycles. Cycles imply patterns, and patterns imply consequences. He records it still because recording is his purpose. But that record, if it contains predictions, becomes dangerous in the wrong hands. And thus the paradox begins. The truest observations are often the most suppressed. The clay tablets that survive from such eras read like fragments of a much larger book. A book written across generations, but edited violently whenever rulers sensed their authority weakening. Some tablets speak of omens in coded language, metaphors to veil meaning from uninitiated eyes. Others are more direct, describing a body whose rise in the sky brought winds so fierce they uprooted trees, storms so wide they turned day to dusk, and tides that swallowed coastlines whole. These descriptions feel less like fantasies and more like the testimonies of people trying to explain trauma using the vocabulary available to them. A visitor in the sky is a convenient metaphor, but also a plausible observation for communities living under open horizons. When modern scientists read such accounts, they divide them into categories: mythic exaggeration, astronomical observation, or environmental memory. But the lines blur when multiple cultures describe not just a bright light, but perturbations in the environment consistent with comet showers, solar disruption, or gravitational anomalies. Those ancients, without our technology, may have sensed things in intuitive ways: changes in animal behavior, shifts in winds, invisible pulls at the edge of their world, signs that something larger was unfolding beyond human control. Even now, if you stand under a truly dark sky in a remote place, the universe presses upon you with a weight that is almost physical. You understand intuitively what they must have felt: awe mixed with fragility. The ancients had no illusions of control. They respected the sky because they knew it could destroy their crops, flood their rivers, scorch their fields. They were watchers in the truest sense, using the heavens as a clock, but also as a warning system. Their myths may be dramatized, but the fear behind them is real. Consider the flood narratives repeated across continents: a world drowned, a few survivors, a reset of civilization. These stories may be rooted in geological events like glacial meltwater pulses or regional sea level rise, but the timing often coincides with cosmic disturbances theorized by modern researchers. If a long-period object brought with it showers of debris that collided with Earth's atmosphere, it could trigger atmospheric shifts, fires, and storms capable of reshaping entire landscapes. The ancients would encode these cataclysms as divine punishment or cosmic cleansing, not because they misunderstood the events, but because such stories helped their communities process loss. Now picture the rulers living through such times. A king whose authority derives from divine favor must maintain the illusion that the heavens reflect his virtue. But if a fiery object crosses the sky for weeks, refusing to obey the rituals meant to keep the cosmos in order, the king stands exposed. Priests scramble to reinterpret omens. Scribes rush to record revised rituals. Temples echo with fear rather than faith. And when the crisis passes, the rulers rewrite the narrative. The visitor becomes a metaphor. The destruction becomes a lesson in morality, and the raw astronomical memory is polished into myth. Over time, the original observations blur, the details fade, and the visitor becomes a story meant to inspire or frighten rather than a warning. Rooted in reality, yet fragments remain untouched because time often protects what power cannot reach. Archaeologists dig through abandoned cities, finding records compressed by earth rather than altered by decree. A sealed jar in a forgotten wall may contain a tablet untouched by censorship. A collapsed library may hide works that escaped revision simply because the rubble shielded them. These accidental preservations create a mosaic of memory. And in this mosaic, the same motif appears: a returning body, Cycle. A reckoning dot in our era, we study orbital mechanics and infrared signatures. We calculate perturbations in the orbits of distant icy objects and propose unseen planets to explain them. We publish papers, debate models, refine telescopes, but the heart of the inquiry is the same as it was for the astronomer on the rooftop millennia ago. We are trying to understand the patterns that govern the sky and, by extension, our own fate. Our tools are sharper, our models more precise. But the fundamental question remains: what else moves through the darkness unseen, on a path that intersects ours? As you sit here listening, imagine the distance between the ancient and the modern shrinking. Imagine the clay tablet and the digital star map lying side by side. One filled with symbols pressed by hand, the other coded in pixels and equations, both whispering a similar idea that the universe is full of wanderers. And some of them return on cycles larger than our recorded history. Some returns bring only beauty. Others bring change so immense it becomes myth. Close your eyes and picture the visitor as the ancients saw it. A bright, swollen orb hanging low in the sky, burning red and gold, casting shadows that stretched for miles, stirring winds with its heat, making animals restless, making rulers afraid. Picture its slow drift across the heavens, silent and inexorable. Picture the people watching it, some praying, some calculating, some writing. Picture the kings deciding what must be erased to preserve their rule. And picture the truth surviving anyway, waiting for a night like this when someone chooses to listen. And so the visitor lingers in the imagination, not as a monster or mythic beast, but as a celestial traveler woven into the deepest memory of humanity. The ancients did not fear a beast. They feared a pattern, a cycle that returned whether kings ruled wisely or foolishly, whether empires were strong or fading. They feared the reminder that the sky did not bend to their will. And when you read their accounts with patience, you begin to sense a tone beneath the words, not hysteria, but resignation, as though they knew this cycle was simply part of the cosmos, something older than cities, older than gods, older even than humanity's attempts to understand itself. There is a strange comfort in the idea that humanity has lived through such cycles before. It means our species carries a resilience encoded in stories, in rituals, in the instinct to rebuild. But there is also sorrow in the recognition that knowledge is fragile, not because the universe hides its truths, but because people in power often choose to hide them. When rulers believed the visitor threatened their ability to govern, they reshaped the narrative until the threat seemed spiritual rather than celestial. They focused attention away from the sky and toward rituals, sacrifices, or obedience. In their worldview, control mattered more than truth, and if the heavens refused to be controlled, then the memory of their defiance must be erased. Yet the memory refused to vanish. Across the desert, in a city swallowed by dunes, archaeologists uncovered inscriptions that mentioned a burning passenger of heaven, described as a giant red sphere trailing dust like a tail. In another region far to the east, a bamboo manuscript, once hidden in a noble family's vault, told of a fiery traveler, whose return coincided with meteor showers that lit the night in brilliant arcs. These documents were separated by thousands of miles and belonged to cultures that never shared trade routes. Yet both described a similar event, a bright body whose presence reshaped the sky. This convergence, repeated enough times across enough continents, forces even the most skeptical mind to consider the experience. Picture the world during one of these returns. Ancient forests stretch endlessly. Cities are small islands of stone and mud, and most people live under skies untainted by artificial light. In such a world, anything unusual in the heavens would dominate the night. A bright object far larger than any star, glowing in colors rarely seen, would not be subtle. It would paint the landscape with strange hues, shifting from deep orange to shimmering gold, as if the sky itself had caught fire. People would gather in open courtyards, stare upward with a mixture of fear and fascination, whispering prayers to whatever forces governed their lives. But not everyone would respond with fear. Some, like the Watchers of Babylon, studied the sky for long hours, measuring angles with strings and shadows, comparing new sights to records preserved in libraries and temples. Their intent was not to worship, but to understand. They cataloged changes meticulously, noting the exact nights when the visitor grew brighter, the way its light affected the horizon, the direction in which its tail pointed. These observations would later become metaphors, then myths, then fragmentary warnings embedded in legend. But their origins were empirical. As grounded in observation as the work of astronomers today, imagine those ancient watchers as the intellectual ancestors of modern astrophysicists. Their tools were crude, but their patience was vast. Their knowledge of mathematics was limited by the counting systems of their era, but their discipline was unwavering. They recognized patterns over generations, handing down the duty of watching two apprentices who continued the work as faithfully as their masters. This continuity of observation is what makes the persistence of the visitor's memory so remarkable. It was not a single event witnessed by a single people. It was a recurring phenomenon that left soft footprints across the world's earliest sciences. And yet, for all their dedication, they could not stop the destructive power of interpretation. A prophecy misread could cause panic. A warning misunderstood could collapse order. When a ruler felt threatened by predictions that did not align with his assurances of divine favor, he did what rulers often do. He criminalized knowledge. Some records were burned, others hidden, and some rewritten until their meaning shifted entirely. Instead of describing the sky, they described morality. Instead of predicting cycles, they predicted punishments. This shift was subtle at first, then sweeping. Over time, a scientific observation became a theological threat, and later, a myth divorced from its original purpose. But myths have a way of carrying truths within them, like seeds hidden inside fruit. A story meant to frighten a child into obedience may contain a faint echo of an astronomical event. A ritual meant to celebrate a deity may preserve the memory of a celestial alignment. Even now, when we analyze myths using the lens of comparative anthropology, we discover that stories separated by entire oceans share patterns too intricate to be coincidence. A fiery sky, a returning sphere, waters rising, darkness lingering, fires falling, a cycle ending and beginning again. These are not the details of dreams, they are the fingerprints of history. Now consider how modern instruments, telescopes, satellites, infrared detectors have begun noticing anomalies, objects moving in ways that suggest the presence of something large, distant, and unseen. A gravitational pull that does not align with known planets. A clustering of orbits that suggests a hidden mass. Scientists propose the existence of a distant world, massive enough to influence the outer solar system, yet faint enough to escape detection. They call it Planet 9, a cold and distant giant orbiting quietly in the darkness. They debate its mass, its orbit, its origin. They model scenarios, refute errors, then revisit anomalies. In many ways, they are repeating the work of the ancient watchers, guided by technology instead of instinct, but driven by the same question: what else is out there? As this thought grows in your mind, let your breathing slow. The night around you deepens. You sense that humanity has always lived under a sky filled with mysteries. And though our understanding evolves, our fascination remains unchanged. The ancients looked upward and felt small. We look upward and feel curious. The difference is subtle but profound. And yet, if a celestial visitor with a long orbit truly exists, then we share with the ancients a moment that bridges time. We are part of the same story, separated by millennia but united by the same sky. If such a visitor were to return again, modern society would react in ways far different from the ancient world. Satellites would pick up anomalies. News would spread digitally. Governments would prepare statements. Scientists would calculate trajectories. The old fear would return, not fear of the gods, but fear of the unknown. Yet the fundamental truth would be the same. We are small, and the universe is immense. And now, as the story settles for a moment, imagine those kings once more not as villains, but as men grasping desperately for control in a world too vast to contain. Their attempts to erase truth were human, flawed, and ultimately futile. For here you are, thousands of years later, listening to the echoes they tried to silence. The story survived. The visitor's memory endured. And somewhere, perhaps in the cold, dark reaches of the solar system, a wanderer continues its long, silent orbit, indifferent to the fears and hopes of the creatures who watch the sky. And so the thought of that silent wanderer hangs in the air like a question. The universe has asked, and humanity has never fully answered. Imagine it now, a dark, distant world moving through the cold outskirts of the solar system. Its orbit so vast that an entire civilization could rise and fall before it completes a single revolution. Its surface, if it has one, might be locked in perpetual twilight. Its atmosphere thick with elements unknown. Its gravity a hushed pull on the space around it. No wind, no oceans, no cities only. The long, slow drift through cosmic darkness, carrying with it the faint echoes of past encounters. The memories of storms and warmth when it once came close to the sun. It moves without hurry, because time to such a wanderer is not measured in years, but in epochs. Humanity, with all its brilliance, is still learning to see things that move on such scales. Our minds are shaped by daily cycles, seasons, lifespans, calendars. We measure our world in decades, but the visitor moves in the language of millennia, carrying with it the weight of cycles so large that they make the rise and fall of empires feel like brief sparks in a vast night. Perhaps that is why the ancients feared it so deeply. They sensed the size of its rhythm, its disregard for human stories. A creature that moves in the dark without acknowledging our timelines awakens a quiet terror, the terror of insignificance. And yet, within that fear is humility. And within humility is understanding. When you listen closely to the oldest stories, you begin to hear hints of this cosmic rhythm. In the mythology of the high mountains where temples touched the sky, priests spoke of the turning of ages, a moment when the heavens tilted and a new cycle began. In the stories of desert tribes, a great red star passed and brought winds that erased entire settlements. In the tales of island nations, there were years when the sea rose with a quiet fury, drowning fields and erasing harbors that had stood for centuries. These stories are separated by geography and culture, yet they carry the same tone, the same tremor. They are memories of disruption, carried across generations long after the original witnesses had turned to dust. Scientific minds sometimes resist the idea of ancient observations having merit. But the truth is that ancient cultures were far more connected to the sky than we are. Without artificial light to soften the night, without screens to distract them, they watched the heavens with patience we rarely match today. They noticed changes we would miss. What we call anomalies, they called omens. What we call perturbations, they called warnings. And even if they framed their understanding through the lens of gods and spirits, the underlying observations were often remarkably precise. They knew when stars shifted, when planets changed brightness, when new lights appeared in clay tablets found in the ruins of an old coastal city. A scribe described a time when the night sky was split in two, with one half glowing in crimson while the other faded into darkness. Modern astronomers reading the description speculate that it could have been caused by dust and ionized particles from a large, celestial body passing close enough to Earth to disturb the upper atmosphere. To the scribe, it was a supernatural event. To us, it is an atmospheric phenomenon, but the experience he recorded, trembling and unsure, is real in both languages. Other records speak of the sun dimming for weeks, of seasons shifting unpredictably, of crops sprouting in strange patterns. These would have been catastrophic for societies dependent on stable climates. People would flee, migrate, resettle. Wars would begin not just for power, but for survival. A king watching his kingdom falter under conditions he could neither predict nor control would see his divine authority questioned. To preserve order, he would need a new story, one that placed the blame not on a celestial visitor, but on human moral failure, or the anger of neglected gods. In this way, astronomy became theology, and celestial patterns became moral lessons. But underneath those lessons, the data remained. In some temples, untouched inscriptions survive that list star positions and describe nights when the heavens shone with double fire. In mountain caves used by early astronomers, there are markings indicating the rise of a bright object at an angle inconsistent with known planets. A pattern emerges not because someone wants it to, but because human memory, scattered though it is, converges on the same points over and over. When independent cultures describe similar disruptions thousands of years apart, the pattern becomes difficult to dismiss. Modern researchers approach the question with caution. They examine ice cores, sediment layers, isotopic signatures, and tree rings, searching for hints of cosmic influence, spikes of radiation, layers of dust, traces of metals associated with cometary debris. When these signatures appear in alignment with dates referenced in ancient stories, something remarkable happens. Myth begins to resemble a data set. Then the question transforms from "did it happen?" to "what caused it?" Some propose solar flares, others comet fragments, others still a long-period object whose path intersects the inner solar system occasionally. No answer is universally accepted. But the debate itself reveals an old truth. Humans have always looked for causes behind chaos. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine those scientists bending over microscopes, comparing samples, debating in quiet rooms. They are not so different from the ancient watchers on their rooftops, observing the sky with anxious fascination. Both groups seek clarity in complexity. Both seek patterns where chaos seems dominant. Both seek to protect their people through understanding, whether by predicting seasons or modeling orbital dynamics. And both, if faced with evidence of a returning celestial visitor, would feel the same mixture of awe and fear. Now imagine the visitor again, not as a myth or metaphor, but as a real celestial body with a long, cold orbit. Imagine its slow arc through the distant reaches of the solar system, passing through regions so dark that even starlight is weak and thin. Imagine it emerging from that darkness after thousands of years, beginning its long descent toward the inner worlds. It does not choose its path. It simply follows the gravitational script written for it billions of years ago. But its presence disrupts things, shifts the dust fields, disturbs the paths of smaller objects, triggers cascades of debris that eventually drift toward Earth. It is indifferent to the consequences. The way a storm is indifferent to the village it floods, if such a visitor exists. Then its story is still unfolding, as slow and relentless as its orbit. And in that unfolding story, humanity occupies only a momentous fraction of a cycle, a spark in the cosmic night. Yet for that brief moment, we can choose to observe, to understand, to remember. The ancients did, even if their rulers tried to silence them. And now you, sitting in the dark, listening to a story whispered across millennia, become part of that remembering. You are listening to a thread that stretches from the first astronomers to the scientists of today. A thread woven through myths, inscriptions, fossils, and orbits. The visitor may come and go, but the memory of its presence lingers in the human imagination. And now, as your thoughts drift between past and present, Between myth and science, you may begin to sense what those ancient watchers felt, not fear, not confusion, but a strange, deep understanding that the universe is alive with rhythms too vast for any single lifetime to grasp. And still, the story continues. And as the story stretches onward, the universe around you seems to expand with it, a quiet reminder that even in the stillness of night, the cosmos is moving, shifting, speaking in its own language. The ancients listened to that language not with telescopes or algorithms, but with patience and intuition, letting the sky become their calendar, their scripture, their warning. When we read their accounts today, we must remember the world they lived in was not saturated with noise. The night was honest, unpolluted, immense. Every flicker meant something. Every shadow mattered. And so, when they described a fiery visitor that crossed the heavens and returned only after ages, their words were not idle. They were anchored in generations of observation. The truth is that civilizations survive, not because their kings are wise, but because their watchers are attentive. It was the watchers who noticed when seasons shifted, when the river came too early, when a star brightened without reason. It was the watchers who recorded anomalies that the powerful tried to bury. And it is their quiet scribbling that has outlived thrones built of gold and stone. Among those scribblings are details that feel too consistent to dismiss. References to a red star or wandering planet that grew larger night after night. Accounts of dust veils that muted the sun. Descriptions of rains that lasted weeks. Of thunder that shook foundations. Of coastlines that changed shape in the space of a single generation. These are not exaggerations. Geological evidence confirms abrupt shifts, massive floods, volcanic winters, unexplained layers of debris scattered across continents. The ancients framed them through prophecy because prophecy was the only prediction model they had. But underlying those prophecies are empirical observations. When a sky changes in ways unprecedented, people search for meaning and rulers search for control. And when those two impulses collide, what emerges is often a strange hybrid of truth and metaphor. What we inherit thousands of years later is that hybrid half data, half myth waiting to be deciphered. Imagine stepping into a ruined temple cleared of sand for the first time in millennia. The air is cool, still, heavy with dust, older than recorded history. You shine a light across walls lined with carvings, each stroke of the chisel telling a story. One panel shows a king kneeling beneath a blazing circle in the sky, his head bowed, not in reverence, but in fear. Another panel shows waves swallowing the edges of a city, while above it, a massive orb glows with textured lines suggesting fire. The artists were not astronomers, but their imagery conveys a memory passed from generation to generation, a memory of a sky that once behaved in ways no person alive had ever seen. Again, now imagine standing beside archaeologists as they decrypt the symbols, comparing them to star charts and calendars. Their voices echo in the quiet, speaking of alignments and anomalies, of dates that correspond to sudden climate shifts in ice core records. They notice something strange. The timing of these depicted events aligns suspiciously well with periods of environmental upheaval. It is as if the temple walls and Earth's geological layers are telling the same story in two different languages. There is a moment, brief but electric, when everyone stands still, realizing that myths once dismissed as superstition might actually contain faint echoes of scientific fact. That moment changes you. It softens the boundaries between ancient and modern. It forces you to consider the possibility that the ancients were not merely imaginative. They were observant in ways we rarely appreciate. They lived inside the rhythms of the natural world. We stand outside it, and yet, despite all this, the rulers of those ancient lands sought to suppress the truth because truth carries consequences. A returning celestial visitor implies cycles beyond human control, cycles that ignore borders, wealth, and royal decrees. A king who cannot predict or prevent disaster risks losing the obedience of his people. So the kings of old created new stories, reshaped rituals, plastered over inscriptions, recarved tablets, and buried scrolls. But even kings cannot silence memory entirely. Stories escaped in songs, in metaphors, in carvings, too remote to be inspected carefully. A child overheard a whispered tale and repeated it. A traveler carried a version of it across mountains. A priest left a line in the margin of a text. And that is how truths survive. They slip through cracks. Centuries later, explorers stumble upon these cracks, piecing together fragments that feel like clues. They do not always enter the academic record cleanly. Many researchers prefer safe theories, polite uncertainties. But there are always a few who notice the oddities, the star that should not be there, the repeated symbol across cultures, the flood layer that appears in regions with no connection. These scholars push the boundaries of acceptable speculation, not because they seek fame, but because they cannot ignore the clues that whisper from the past. Now imagine the visitor again. Not a monster, just a silent traveler with an orbit so vast that by the time it returns, the world has changed beyond recognition. It approaches slowly, its presence barely detectable at first. But subtle signs accumulate. Disturbances in comet clouds, dust that dims the sun, rising winds at odd times of year. In ancient times, these signs were interpreted as omens. In modern times, they would be monitored by satellites and weather stations. But the emotional response would be the same. A quiet unease. A sense that something vast is stirring. If humanity were to witness such a return today, the experience would differ in its details, but not in its essence. News networks would speculate. Social media would erupt in theories. Governments would measure and model. There would be panic in some places, calm in others. Scientists would caution patience, but the public would hunger for answers. And through it all, the old stories would resurface not as entertainment, but as warnings that maybe we never truly understood. They would remind us that we are not the first to watch the sky tremble. Yet, despite the scale of the visitor and the cycles it represents, there is something profoundly human in the way we respond. We try to understand. We try to protect. We try to remember. That instinct is what preserved the fragments that brought us here tonight. It is what makes you listen, eyes closed, imagining a world shaped by patterns larger than any generation can witness. And perhaps that is why stories like this endure. Not because they frighten us, but because they remind us that we are part of a universe far bigger than our daily concerns. They remind us that the ancients were not as primitive as we assume. They remind us that truth can survive attempts to erase it. And somewhere in the dark, beyond the reach of our brightest telescopes, a wanderer may still be moving slowly toward the sun, carrying with it a memory humanity has never fully understood. The night deepens. The story moves forward, and the visitor continues its silent journey. And so, the visitor drifts farther into your imagination, as if the darkness around you has become an extension of the cosmos itself. There is a strange sensation that comes when you begin to understand a story, not through facts alone, but through the quiet recognition that many truths outlive their explanations. The ancients did not leave us equations or orbital diagrams, but they left impressions deep, resonant impressions of something that changed their world. Those impressions, found in crumbling archives and forgotten ruins, in the architecture of temples and the metaphors of myths, form a pathway that leads us back to a mystery older than recorded time. Picture one of those temple libraries before it fell into ruin. Shelves of clay tablets arranged carefully by generations of scribes, each tablet etched with symbols that recorded laws, trade, poetry, omens, and astronomical observations. The scribe who carved a warning about the bright visitor may not have known that thousands of years later his work would be read by scholars who understood gravitational perturbations and stellar physics. He simply wrote what he saw and what it meant to his people. He wrote because writing preserved truth in a world where memory was fragile. And he wrote knowing that the next cycle might not be gentle. When archaeologists today lift such a tablet from the dust, they hold not just an artifact, but a moment in time, one person's attempt to communicate something profound. And when two tablets from opposite sides of the ancient world tell similar stories, separated by thousands of years and entire civilizations, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. You begin to sense a rhythm, a recurrence, a cycle that the rulers tried to hide. But the earth itself could not forget. The idea that a massive celestial body might influence Earth's climate or geology is not new. Modern science acknowledges that large comets, asteroids, or planetary bodies passing near Earth could create tidal forces, atmospheric disruptions, or gravitational shifts. Our planet has scars that speak of past encounters, craters buried beneath oceans, layers of iridium and sediment, sudden extinctions recorded in fossils. These are the signatures of cosmic visitors. And while not all of them were planets, the fact remains, Earth is not isolated. It interacts with the heavens in ways both subtle and catastrophic. But the visitor described by the ancients was different. It was bright, recurring, and slow-moving. It was not a brief flash across the sky or a streaking comet. It lingered. It approached with the patience of a drifting god. And that patience is what terrified ancient watchers. Anything that lingers in the sky changes the emotional landscape of a people. Days become filled with speculation, nights with fear. Families gather on rooftops to watch. Priests attempt to explain what they cannot fully understand. Rulers issue decrees to maintain order. And somewhere, deep inside the palace archives, scribes try to record the truth without offending those who fear it. Imagine what it must have felt like to see such a visitor without knowing the mechanics of orbits or solar interactions. The glow would intensify night after night. The winds might shift, carrying the scent of dust from distant lands. Animals would behave strangely. Fishermen would hesitate to leave shore. Farmers would whisper to one another about omens. In such a world, the visitor would not be a distant curiosity, would be a presence. Something felt as much as seen. Some tablets describe days when the sun seemed dimmer, hidden behind a veil of dust. Modern scientists might interpret this as atmospheric interference caused by debris. To the ancients, it was a sign of the heavens closing. When crops failed and storms grew violent, they blamed the visitor. When cities were lost to floods, they blamed the visitor. Over time, the visitor became a symbol of chaos, a divine messenger, a destroyer, a judge. And when the cycles passed and calm returned, the old stories hardened into myth. Yet beneath the symbolism, a mathematical structure persists. The Sumerians calculated cycles with astonishing precision. They recorded intervals far too large to be coincidental. Their king lists and astronomical tablets reflect an understanding of time that stretches far beyond human lifespans. This is why the pattern of a returning celestial body fits so strongly within their cosmology. They saw the world not as a straight line, but as a wheel turning, repeating, renewing. If a wanderer returned across vast spans of time, they would not be surprised. They would simply mark the cycle as they had been taught. This cyclical worldview influenced many cultures. In the Andes, high priests spoke of suns that came and went, ages marked by destruction and rebirth. In India, ancient texts described vast cosmic cycles that reset the world periodically. In Mesoamerica, the Maya counted time in great epics, each ending with celestial fire or flooding. In the northern steppes, legends spoke of winter stars that burned red before great migrations began. These stories, separated by oceans, echo one another with unnerving clarity. They all describe endings and beginnings tied to the sky, as if humanity itself is aware, in some deep psychological sense, of cosmic rhythms too large to articulate to modern ears. Such stories sound metaphorical, but to ancient minds, they were memories passed down with care. And though time erodes details, the essence survives. A belief that the world is periodically reshaped by forces beyond human command. Now imagine those rulers. Again. They stood at the apex of society, responsible for order, stability, and the illusion that they controlled the relationship between humans and the divine. If a celestial visitor returned and threw their world into uncertainty, the ruler's only defense was narrative. They would tell their people that the visitor meant purification or blessing rather than disruption. And after the cycle passed, they would edit the archives so that no one remembered the terror. They would hide the tablets that were too honest, burn the scrolls that named the visitor directly, and promote sanitized versions of events. But truth, even buried, has a way of rising again. That is why, thousands of years later, we find bits and pieces tablets hidden in walls, carvings rescued from collapsed halls, fragments reassembled from broken ruins. Each fragment is a whisper from the past, and together they begin to form a voice. And tonight, that voice is speaking to you, not in fear, but in clarity, inviting you to imagine a universe alive with cycles that humanity is only beginning to understand. Somewhere, perhaps far beyond the orbit of Neptune, the visitor still moves. Cold, distant, indifferent, but orbiting still, waiting for the moment when its path bends inward again, when its long sleep in the dark ends and the sun's gravity awakens it like a forgotten memory. And when that moment comes, our world, like the worlds before us, will look to the sky again. And as we drift deeper into this unfolding memory, you may begin to realize that the story of the visitor is not just celestial, it is profoundly human. It reveals our fears, our patterns, our resilience, and our desire to understand the forces that shape our lives from far beyond our reach. The ancients were masters of symbolism, but their symbols often contained literal truths. To them, the heavens were not separate from the earth. They were reflections of one another. A disturbance in the sky mirrored a disturbance in the world below, and so the arrival of a bright red sphere was interpreted not just as an astronomical anomaly, but as a sign that the fabric of reality itself was shifting. Consider how the earliest civilizations conceptualized the universe. They did not see empty space. They saw a living canopy. Stars were not distant suns, but lamps lit by divine forces. Planets were wandering spirits, each with its personality. A bright visitor, therefore, was not an object. It was an arrival, something with intention, destiny, and consequence. Even if they could not articulate gravitational resonance or orbital inclination, they understood the emotional impact. Something vast had entered their domain. Imagine being a shepherd on a hillside thousands of years ago, watching your flocks under a crystal-clear sky. You know every star intimately, as if they were old companions. One night, you notice something strange, a light where none existed before. It grows slowly at first, then more rapidly, its glow deepening into a fierce orange. You call others, and they stare with you, feeling a mixture of awe and dread. The elders whisper stories of past cycles, of ancestors who saw similar lights and lived through storms so violent they carved new shapes into the land. They speak softly, not wanting to frighten the young. But the fear is already there, lodged between your ribs like a cold stone. And yet, all remains. The kind of awe that makes a person feel simultaneously small and protected, as though witnessing something ancient and sacred. The visitor becomes a reminder that there are forces older than humanity, forces that do not bend to kings or priests or armies, forces that shape continents and climates, perhaps even civilizations. In many cultures, this duality of awe and fear took the form of gods. The Anunnaki, whose presence is carved into Sumerian reliefs, were depicted not just as creators or judges, but as beings associated with the heavens. Their crowns bore star symbols, their robes were decorated with constellations, and their myths often referenced celestial events as metaphors for divine intervention. Whether they were actual visitors or symbolic representations of cosmic patterns remains a debate. But the connection is unmistakable. The ancients saw a relationship between the skies and the origins of humanity. The visitor was part of that relationship. Now, imagine the roles of those priests who acted as intermediaries between the rulers and the heavens. They were responsible for interpreting signs, advising kings, and calming the population during celestial disturbances. But when the visitor grew too bright, too unpredictable, they faced an impossible task. How could they explain something that defied the rituals they had spent their lives mastering? When storms came too early and the moon rose in strange hues, the people asked questions the priests could not answer. And when the priests stumbled, the kings felt the ground beneath their authority shift, so the rulers responded with control. They demanded rewritten records, changed prophecies, new rituals that framed the visitor as a manageable sign rather than an uncontrollable force. They created myths of triumph, gods defeating serpents of fire, heroes slaying sky dragons. These stories were comforting because they implied victory. But beneath the surface, the truth remained: the sky had changed, and there was nothing humans could do to stop it. Even now, this truth resonates. We live in an age of technology, but our control remains limited. We can predict storms, but not prevent them. We can measure comets, but not alter their paths. And if a long-period object like the visitor were to return, our reaction would mirror those of ancient times, a combination of science, fear, curiosity, and the primal urge to find meaning. Modern astronomers detect anomalies that hint at unseen masses in the far reaches of the solar system. Infrared surveys reveal faint objects drifting on elongated orbits. Small, icy bodies in the Kuiper Belt move in ways that imply gravitational tugging. Something is out there, perhaps not the exact visitor of ancient fear, but a distant, massive body with an orbit too large to map quickly. Scientists debate its nature. Some say it must be rocky. Others insist it is gaseous. Some claim it has always been there. Others propose a wandering origin. What if the ancients witnessed its last approach? What if their stories are echoes of an event our modern world has forgotten? Consider that human civilization as we know it. Agriculture, cities, written language began only a few thousand years ago. A visitor with an orbit of 10 or 20,000 years would have passed long before our current technological era. But its memory could survive in myth. That is what myths are, echoes of experiences too, immense to fit into scientific language at the time. Picture a world freshly recovering from cataclysm. The ice is melting, seas are rising, species are vanishing. Nomadic groups cluster together for safety. They look to the skies for signs of stability, but the skies give them confusion. A bright object, unfamiliar and powerful, hangs above them for weeks. Its tail, if it had one, stretches like fire across the horizon. Nights are filled with strange lights. Days feel different. And when the visitor finally moves away, the world left behind is changed. Forests flooded, coastlines reshaped, climates altered. This would be enough to birth mythologies that last thousands of years. Some of those mythologies describe beings who taught humanity new skills after the destruction: agriculture, astronomy, building techniques. Whether these beings were symbolic representations of knowledge reborn or memories of actual encounters is unknown. What matters is that the visitor's arrival marked a dividing line in human memory, a before and an after. As you listen to this story unfold, you may begin to feel as if humanity is not moving blindly forward, but is instead circling a vast pattern. just as the visitor circles the sun. We are like children who inherited half a map but forgot the instructions. Yet something in us remembers the same instinct that made our ancestors watch the night sky with reverence. And perhaps that is why tonight the story feels familiar, even though you may never have heard it before. It taps into something ancient within you, a sense that the universe is alive with rhythms, that history is not linear but cyclical, that humanity's greatest stories are not invented but remembered. The visitor is not a stranger. It is an old memory returning. And as the memory of the visitor returns, not through fear, but through understanding, you begin to see how deeply it shaped the foundations of civilization. All the great cultures, from the plains to the mountains, from the river valleys to the islands, behaved as if something in their distant past had reset the world. They built monuments aligned to the heavens, not out of aesthetic curiosity, but because the sky had once dictated their survival. Their temples pointed to solstices, equinoxes, and star risings, as if waiting for a familiar light to return. Their myths spoke of cycles of destruction and renewal, as though reminding the future that what has come before may come again. Picture the enormous stone structures, scattered across the world pyramids. Megaliths, observatories carved into mountainsides. These constructions are not simply architectural marvels. They are memories set in stone. The builders were telling us something they couldn't put into words. Watch the sky. Because the sky remembers even when people forget. When archaeologists measure the alignments of these monuments, they find orientations that match celestial events with astonishing precision. It is as if the ancients wanted the earth itself to turn into a clock, ticking toward the next great cycle. Consider the Great Pyramid fields, the stone towers that rise from rocky cliffs, the ancient step temples where priests once stood to observe the heavens. These were not random constructions. They were instruments, vast, stable instruments created to track the slow dance of stars and planets. When the visitor was last seen, its path may have been woven into their architecture. A temple doorway might frame the rising of a particular star. A corridor might align with a solstice sunrise. But somewhere within these structures, subtle markings allude to objects that do not fit the normal pattern of the known planets. Objects that wander in ways that puzzled ancient watchers. Imagine being one of those watchers, a young apprentice learning to read the sky, standing beside an elder whose eyes have memorized constellations. The elder points toward a faint glimmer just above the horizon and explains that his own teacher once saw a similar light many decades ago. He speaks with a mixture of pride and caution, as if passing down a secret too important to misinterpret. You listen closely, feeling the weight of a knowledge so large it presses against your chest. You look again at the faint glimmer and realize it is growing brighter, night after night. You feel excitement, fear, and reverence all at once. And in that moment, the visitor no longer feels like a distant myth. It becomes real. Such apprentices grew into priests, astronomers, scholars, and storytellers. Their accounts formed the backbone of myths that traveled through centuries. Over time, their careful observations were overshadowed by religious interpretations, then by royal censorship. But the essence persisted, encoded in language, ritual, and art. In some civilizations, the visitor was a god. In others, a destroyer. In others, a teacher. These differences tell us more about human culture than about the visitor itself. A celestial event is neutral. It is humans who give it meaning. Modern humanity, with its telescopes and satellites, is rediscovering what ancient watchers once knew instinctively, that our planet exists in a dynamic cosmic environment, shaped not only by the sun and moon, but by wandering bodies whose paths brush our world in cycles, measured not in centuries, but in millennia. When astronomers propose the existence of a distant planetary body with a long, eccentric orbit, they do so with equations and models. But in an abstract sense, they are speaking the same language as the ancient scribe who described a red traveler returning after ages. If you were to place those two descriptions side by side, the modern simulation and the ancient carving, you might feel a shiver of recognition, as if two halves of a forgotten puzzle are slowly being pushed together. Now imagine the visitor during its closest approach in ancient times. The earth tilts slightly under the pull of unseen forces. Tides shift in strange patterns. Winds pick up with an intensity that feels unnatural. The nights glow with shimmering dust. People dream vividly, unsure whether their minds are echoing the tension in the air or responding to something deeper, a subconscious memory, perhaps inherited from ancestors who lived through previous cycles in some regions. The visitor appeared not as a peaceful orb, but as a fiery omen. Dust and particles in the upper atmosphere refracted its light, making it flicker like a living flame. In others, its color shifted from deep red to molten gold, giving the impression of a second sun rising in defiance of the first. Imagine what such a sight would do to the psyche of a city. Priests would gather on temple rooftops, repeating incantations. Kings would demand explanations. Ordinary people would stare upward in silence, knowing instinctively that something immense and ancient had awakened when the visitor finally began to retreat into the outer darkness again. The world it left behind was never the same. Floodplains shifted, forests changed shape, coastlines were redrawn. A generation later, those who remembered the visitor would fade into legend. A century later, the stories would become metaphors. A millennium later, the details would be lost. But somewhere, buried in the ruins of cities long forgotten, small pieces of truth remained waiting. And now, in our age of technology, humanity is again piecing together the fragments. Scientists calculate orbits that resemble the rhythms described in forgotten manuscripts. Archaeologists find carvings of flaming disks that match descriptions of celestial anomalies. Linguists decode metaphors that point to physical events. Suddenly, the past feels less like myth and more like memory. Tonight, as you listen, you stand at the crossroads of those memories. The visitor may still be wandering, tracing its ancient path through the cold, distant reaches. It does not know its effect on human history, nor does it care. But humans remember, even when they try to forget. And that memory, fragile but persistent, has survived through empires, religions, wars. And dreams, you can almost sense it now, the quiet pulse of a cycle turning. The faint echo of a distant world making its way back toward the sun. And as this memory of cycles deepens, you begin to sense something that the ancients understood instinctively, but we, in our modern noise, have nearly forgotten that history is not only written in ruins and artifacts, but in the sky itself. The heavens are a vast archive, storing patterns far older than writing, older even than myth. Every orbit, every shift, every wandering light tells a story. And among those countless movements, the ancients remembered one in particular. A visitor whose presence echoed across continents, leaving behind traces subtle enough to hide, but powerful enough to endure. Imagine the visitor now as it drifts through the cosmic dark, its surface absorbing the faint light of distant stars. To us, it is an unseen silhouette, but to the early watchers of Earth, it was a presence that reshaped their world. They looked upward at a time when human life was simpler, but the sky was infinitely richer. Without light pollution, the Milky Way glowed like a river of silver dust. Every star was visible. Every movement was noted. And when the visitor first appeared, a dim spark on the horizon, almost imperceptible, it was not lost in the glare of city lights. It stood out like a prophecy carved into the night. Night after night, it brightened. At first, it was a curiosity, then a sign, then an omen. Farmers whispered prayers to keep their fields safe. Sailors avoided distant waters where the visitor's light shimmered on the waves. Traders carried news of strange winds rising from the sea, of birds migrating at the wrong time, of animals behaving oddly. These signs spread fear, but they also spread awareness, a realization that the world was reacting to something beyond it. When the visitor grew large enough to cast faint shadows, the priests gathered. Imagine them standing in silent rows atop their temples, robes swaying in the wind, the soft glow of torches reflecting in their eyes. They chanted not out of superstition, but out of a desperate desire to understand. To them, the visitor was a riddle sent by the gods. But beneath their rituals was the same instinct that drives modern scientists, the drive to decode the unknown. Some of those priests recorded what they saw. They drew diagrams of the visitor's path, noting its angle and apparent speed. They observed how its color changed from crimson to amber to gold. They recorded nights when the stars near it dimmed, as if swallowed by its glow. Their inscriptions, preserved accidentally through time, show an attention to detail that rivals early astronomy. They measured cycles with astonishing patience, even when their rulers demanded more comforting narratives. But rulers cannot command the sky, nor can they command the truth. When the visitor's presence became undeniable, fear seeped into palaces. Imagine a king pacing his chamber while advisors whisper interpretations, some claiming the visitor is a divine test, others calling it a punishment for the king's failures. The king's face tightens with worry because he knows the people look to him for answers. If he cannot provide them, his power weakens. And so the suppression begins, not out of malice, but out of fear. He orders revisions of the astronomical records. He instructs the priests to alter their interpretations. He commands the scribes to recarve tablets so the visitor appears symbolic rather than literal. This is how history is shaped, not by the truth of the event, but by the fear it inspires. What survives is a mixture of fact and fiction, fragments of a story half remembered and half buried, and yet even suppressed truth leaves shadows. Even erased lines leave impressions on the clay. The visitor lived on in metaphors, in songs, in the stories told by grandmothers to children on cold nights. These stories traveled across mountains, deserts, oceans. They changed shape, but not essence. They described a red star, a fiery traveler, a second sun, a burning eye in the sky. They described floods and storms and migrations. They described endings that felt like beginnings. Modern science calls these myths archetypes, patterns that recur across cultures. But beneath those archetypes may lie literal memories. When researchers compare stories from different civilizations, they find uncanny similarities, as if humanity collectively witnessed something and then collectively forgot the details. But forgetting is never complete. Even erased stories leave traces in the world. Deep beneath layers of sediment, geologists find evidence of abrupt climatic shifts. In ice cores pulled from the poles, scientists discover chemical signatures of ancient cosmic dust. In fossil layers, they identify moments when species abruptly declined. These physical clues match remarkably well with the timelines of ancient myths. It is as if the Earth itself remembers what humanity forgot. Now imagine that moment of closest approach in some distant age. The visitor hangs above the horizon like a glowing wound, spreading colors across the night. It is beautiful, but unsettling. Its light reflects on rivers, lakes, and seas, turning them into mirrors of fire. Winds carry dust from far lands, giving the air a metallic scent. People gather in villages and cities, staring upward with awe that borders on terror. Some pray, some run. Some simply freeze, unable to process the scale of what they are seeing. And when the visitor finally retreats back into the cosmic dark, humanity is left with a world subtly but unmistakably changed. Rivers shift course. Seasons become unpredictable for years. Crops struggle. Populations migrate. Empires weaken. The visitor does not destroy civilizations, it disrupts them, and disruption is enough to reshape history. When you think of those ancient kings now, you may feel a strange sympathy. They were not evil for hiding the truth. They were simply overwhelmed by a phenomenon far bigger than themselves. They feared panic. They feared loss of power. They feared admitting they did not understand the world they claimed to rule. And so they rewrote the sky into a story that preserved their authority. But in doing so, they weakened humanity's memory. Yet memory finds a way back. That is why, in our time, researchers, astronomers, historians, and storytellers piece together these fragments. That is why you are listening now, taking part in a rediscovery that spans millennia. The cycle may continue with or without our awareness, but awareness gives us a gift the ancients did not have. Perspective. The visitor is not a doom. It is a reminder that humanity exists within a larger cosmic dance, one that is beautiful, mysterious, and humbling. It is a reminder that we are part of something vast and ancient, a story not of endings, but of cycles. And somewhere, deep in the cold, dark halo of the solar system, the visitor drifts onward, patient as ever, waiting for the moment when its long arc brings it back into the sun's embrace once more. And so the visitor fades once more into the vastness, and humanity continues on with its ordinary routines, unaware that distant in the cold darkness, something ancient is inching back toward the sun. But even if people forget, the earth remembers. The stones, the ice, the sediment. The myths, everything that has endured carries a faint trace of the cycles that shaped it. Like the rings of a tree, the world holds patterns that repeat through ages, each one leaving behind quiet but unmistakable marks. And if you know where to look, these marks form a timeline far older than any civilization. Imagine walking through a canyon carved by wind and water over millions of years. Each layer of rock tells a story of warmth, of ice, of floods, of fire. As you place your hand against a cool, ancient surface, you are touching a moment in time when the earth wore a different face. There were ages when deserts were oceans, when jungles were frozen tundra, when mountains rose from the sea. These shifts did not happen randomly. They came in pulses, patterns, rhythms. And sometimes, the timing of these rhythms aligns uncannily with the forgotten cycles described in ancient myths. Geologists studying these layers often stumble upon anomalies, thin deposits of ash where no volcano existed, sudden spikes in rare elements found in meteorites, abrupt boundaries marking the disappearance of species. These anomalies appear at intervals spaced thousands of years apart. Some blame comets. Others suggest solar activity. But a few quietly cautiously wonder whether a distant, wandering body could be responsible for triggering cosmic debris or shifting gravitational tides, enough to influence Earth's environment. They do not claim certainty. But neither did the ancient watchers. Knowledge begins in wonder, not in answers. Now picture an ancient harbor town at the edge of a wide sea. Fishermen prepare their boats before dawn, but something feels different in the air. The tides rise earlier than expected. The water glimmers with a faint reddish reflection long before the sun peeks over the horizon. The fishermen exchange uneasy glances. They have seen strange tides before tides that came during the last stories told by their grandparents. Stories of a burning light in the sky. They do not yet know what is causing the change, but they feel it in their bones, in the way the waves move, in the way the wind breathes, high above the harbor. In a stone observatory built into the cliff, a group of astronomers stand silently. They are watching a point in the sky barely visible, yet unmistakably brighter than it should be. They compare notes from decades earlier. They recall tales told by their elders. They measure angles with tools of wood and string. And though they cannot yet grasp the mechanics, they sense a truth. Something vast is returning. It begins slowly. The visitor brightens. The air thickens with dust. Storms become unpredictable. The astronomers try to warn the rulers, but the rulers are focused on maintaining order. They hold festivals to distract the population, declare special rituals to appease the gods, and issue proclamations calling for unity. But nature does not obey proclamations. Rain patterns shift, crops dry, food becomes scarce, and unrest grows. The visitor does not destroy the city, it simply disrupts it enough to reveal its weaknesses. When we read such accounts today, compressed into a few lines of ancient script, they feel distant and vague. But imagine living through such a moment without modern technology. You would not have satellite images or scientific explanations. You would only have your senses and the stories passed down by those who witnessed earlier cycles. In that world, a bright red light in the sky, even if far away, would shape your behavior, your fears, your decisions. It would shape the fate of your community. That is why these cycles left such deep imprints on human memory. Now shift your imagination to our modern world. A scientist working in a quiet laboratory notices subtle deviations in the orbits of distant, icy objects. She forms a hypothesis. A large, unseen planet could be influencing them. Her colleagues debate it, but cannot dismiss the math. Meanwhile, another researcher analyzing sediment cores finds layers of cosmic dust that appear at intervals. A third studies ancient myths and notices recurring themes. None of them know each other, yet each touches a different piece of a cycle humanity once recognized collectively. If you were to gather all these researchers into one room and lay their findings on a single table, mathematical models, ice core graphs, ancient carvings, astronomical anomalies, they would form a pattern. Not a perfect one, not an indisputable one, but a pattern strong enough to make even the most cautious mind pause. And in that pause lies possibility. Maybe the visitor is real, not as a fiery destroyer painted in fear, but as a long-lost member of our solar family, wandering in a path so wide and slow that it appears only rarely in human history. A body moving in silence, pulling at dust, stirring debris, nudging comets. A celestial presence that humanity once watched with naked eyes, then forgot, then remembered through myth, and now seeks again with technology. If it does exist, it is not malevolent. It is simply old. Older than kingdoms. Older than stories. Older than the human species itself. Imagine it now, drifting patiently toward the sun once again. Its surface cold and dark, its orbit steady and ancient. Unaware of the lives on Earth who tell its story. Unaware of the civilizations that rise and fall between its visits. Unaware that somewhere, right now, people are piecing together clues about its past appearances. You may feel a strange sense of connection to this wanderer, as if your life is one small breath in a much larger cycle. And perhaps that is the true meaning of the ancient stories, not fear, but perspective. A reminder of how brief human history is compared to the rhythms of the universe. A reminder that we are passengers, not masters. And yet, even as passengers, we watch the skies with the same curiosity that guided the ancient scribes. We calculate, we search, we wonder. And somewhere across the endless night, the visitor continues on its slow, inevitable path. And so the idea of this distant traveler lingers in the quiet space of your mind, like a faint echo from a time before memory. The ancients may not have spoken our language, but they understood silence. They understood cycles. They understood the weight of the unknown. And in their understanding, they left behind a trail, not a breadcrumb trail, but a constellation of clues scattered across the world. Clues that begin to glow the moment you look at them through the lens of curiosity rather than certainty. Imagine for a moment the world thousands of years ago, when human life was slower, simpler, yet somehow more connected to the real rhythms of nature. Nights lasted longer. The stars felt closer. The horizon was not interrupted by buildings or machines. People lived by the sky. Their days were bounded by sunrise and sunset. Their calendars were written in shadows and moon phases. In such a world, the arrival of a strange, bright object was not a footnote, was an event that shaped years. There are old stories of entire communities staying awake through the night, staring at the horizon, whispering among themselves. Children clung to their mothers. Elders stood silently, remembering the last time they saw this light. Hunters returned early from the forest, uneasy. Dogs barked at the sky. Birds flew at odd hours. And somewhere in the darkness, perhaps sitting near a fire, a young storyteller memorized every detail, knowing that the world was about to change and that future generations would need to understand. These storytellers became the bridge between cycles. Their words traveled farther than records carved in stone. Their stories carried a truth that kings tried to bury but could not kill. Picture now an ancient city that has survived many cycles. Its walls are tall, its streets are busy, its people confident in their progress. But beneath that confidence is a quiet anxiety inherited from ancestors who lived through disruptions long forgotten. The city's astronomers maintain observatories. At the highest points, not because the king commands it, but because their tradition demands vigilance. They watch the stars as faithfully as their ancestors, whispering the old warnings under their breath. One night, one of them notices a faint glimmer. He hesitates, thinking perhaps it is an illusion. But the next night, it returns, brighter. He consults the records. Something about the angle, the color, the movement feels familiar. A chill runs down his spine as he flips through old tablets and scrolls. He finds a description carved in fading script, a description of a red wanderer that came long ago. His hands tremble as he reads words written by someone who has been dead for thousands of years, yet whose voice feels suddenly alive. He rushes to tell the high priest or the palace scholar. But instead of alarm, he is met with caution. They do not want panic. They do not want the king to worry. They ask him to continue observing quietly. They assure him that once they understand more, they will inform the people. But deep down, the astronomer knows the truth. They are afraid not of the visitor, but of what it means for them. Because when the sky changes, power changes. The astronomer returns to his observatory night after night. The visitor grows brighter. Birds migrate at strange times. Harvests fail in isolated regions. The horizon glows with a strange hue on cloudless evenings. But his warnings are muted by the fear of rulers who believe that acknowledging the phenomenon might unravel their authority. And so, as the visitor approaches, the city remains unprepared, not for destruction, but for disruption. That is the tragedy repeated through cycles. Not that the visitor brings doom, but that human pride brings blindness. In modern times, we like to think we have outgrown such blindness. We trust science. We trust data. But the truth is more complicated. Even now, when astronomers propose the existence of a distant planet, skeptics dismiss them. When anomalies appear in the outer solar system, some ignore them. When ancient myths align with scientific curiosity, many laugh. And yet, beneath the noise of certainty, the quiet work continues. Researchers compare notes. Satellites scan the sky. Simulations run endlessly. And every now and then, a whisper. Emerges a subtle shift in the orbit of a distant object. A glow in a region of the sky that should be dark. A perturbation that defies current models. These whispers are the modern echoes of ancient omens. Imagine. Now a research team in a remote observatory high in the mountains. Snow surrounds the dome. The night is clear, sharp, and bitter cold. Inside, the astronomers huddle around screens shimmering with star maps. One detects a faint movement in a region known for its emptiness. At first they think it is noise, an artifact of the sensor. But after running the scan twice, then 3 times, the movement persists. A small, slow drift, a body far too faint to detect by visible light, but present in infrared. They trace its path backward. The simulation shows a long, looping arc, a path unlike anything in the known solar system. A path so elongated it would take tens of thousands of years to complete a single revolution. The room falls silent, not because they fear the object, but because they understand the magnitude of what they are seeing. A wanderer that could have passed near Earth long before human civilization formed. A visitor whose last approach might have been the root of myths spoken in languages now extinct. They examine its potential mass, its gravitational influence. They compare notes with other teams who have seen strange motion in Kuiper Belt objects. Slowly, a picture emerges, vague but compelling. Something large exists out there. Something that affects the orbits of distant, icy bodies. Something dark, cold, ancient, and unseen. And as these scientists stand staring at their discovery, they unknowingly join a lineage stretching back to the first watchers, those who stood on temple roofs millennia ago. Trembling at the sight of a brightening point of light, trying to understand what it meant. Science continues the work of myth. Myth preserves what science has forgotten. In this way, humanity becomes a single story told across thousands of years, a story of awe and fear intertwined. A story of awe and fear intertwined. A story of cycles that stretch far beyond the boundaries of kingdoms, empires, and eras. And perhaps, if the visitor truly still wanders the outer darkness, drifting slowly toward the warmth of the sun once again, humanity will be ready this time, not with fear or denial, but with understanding. With knowledge gathered across ages, whispered by ancient scribes and confirmed by modern telescopes. The universe does not hide its patterns. It merely waits for us to recognize them. And as we follow the path of the visitor across the ancient sky, drifting through lost memories and forgotten cycles, we begin to notice something even more profound. That humanity's relationship with the cosmos has always been driven by a quiet longing. A longing not just to survive, but to understand. A longing to hear the universe speak, even if its voice is a whisper carried across millennia. And in this longing, you find a connection between the modern scientist peering through a telescope and the ancient shepherd staring upward in fear and wonder. Imagine a desert thousands of years ago, still and silent under a sky so vast it feels endless. A single fire burns, illuminating the faces of nomads gathered around it. Their elder begins to speak, not from a script or text, but from memory passed down through countless generations. He tells of a time when the sky glowed red and the nights were as bright as dawn. He tells of winds that carried dust like hot embers, of seas that rose and swallowed entire coastlines, of forests that changed within a lifetime. The children listen, wide-eyed. The adults nod, having heard the story many times. They do not know the science behind such events, but they feel their truth. Across the world, in a land of ancient forests, another elder tells a similar story. He speaks of a fiery star that crossed the heavens slowly, leaving behind a shimmering tail that lit the night. He speaks of animals fleeing long before the storms arrived, as if something deep within them sensed the coming change. He describes how his ancestors built shelters in the mountains, believing the ground would be safer there. And though his language is different and his people have never met those of the desert, the essence of his story is the same. These echoes form a tapestry, a vast interwoven fabric of human memory. Each thread represents a culture, each not a moment of crisis, each pattern a cycle repeated across time. And somewhere in that tapestry lies the visitor, woven not as a god or demon, but as a celestial presence that shaped the fate of countless generations. Now, imagine the visitor during one of its ancient passes. If it came close enough to be visible as more than a dot, its presence would have dominated the sky. It would not have been a normal star, it would have moved too slowly, too deliberately. Night after night, its position would shift just a little, giving the impression of a living thing traveling across the heavens. Its glow might have flickered as dust swirled around it. Its tail, if it carried debris, would have trailed behind like a burning ribbon to someone living in that time. It would have felt as if the sky itself were watching them. Humans, in their need to understand, turned to patterns. They tracked the visitor's movement against familiar constellations, building calendars and predictions based on these shifts. Some predictions proved accurate, others did not. But the act of observing shaped their cultures, pushing them toward science long before the word existed in one ancient civilization. Astronomers carved a record of the visitor's movement into a long stone slab. The symbols, though eroded by time, seemed to show a looping path, not a straight line, but a curved arc that appears and disappears at irregular intervals. Scholars debate the meaning, but if the interpretation is correct, it would be one of the earliest attempts to map a celestial orbit. Imagine their pride in capturing such a mystery. Imagine their fear when they realized the cycle might return after their lifetimes. Imagine their frustration when rulers ignored their warnings, insisting on rituals rather than preparations. That tension between knowledge and power continues even today. Modern astronomers face similar challenges. They discover anomalies in orbital data, shifts that cannot be explained by the known planets. They publish papers hinting at a massive object lurking in the outer solar system. Some colleagues support them. Others challenge their methods. Funding agencies hesitate. Journalists exaggerate. Governments remain silent. And through all of this, the scientists continue to watch, to measure, to model, because they, like the ancient watchers, feel that something is out there, and perhaps the visitor is not alone. Some theories suggest that massive objects often travel in pairs, bound by gravity in a silent cosmic dance. If so, the visitor may have a companion, another dark wanderer drifting through the cold, unseen. Whether this is true, no one yet knows. But the possibility adds another layer to the ancient myths, many of which describe dual forces, twin stars, twin gods, twin cycles. In some cultures, the sky's destroyer was accompanied by a sky's bringer, a light that restored what the Dark One disrupted. Whether these metaphors describe real celestial bodies or symbolic opposites is unclear. But the presence of duality is notable, as if ancient storytellers sensed that cosmic forces often come in pairs. Now imagine our modern world if the visitor began to brighten once more. Satellites would detect infrared signatures, first, faint, cold, distant. Observatories would confirm a slow movement. Debates would erupt across the scientific community. Some would call for caution. Others would insist on transparency. Social media would explode with theories. Governments would weigh the political consequences of public panic. But unlike the ancient watchers, modern humanity would not be blind. We have instruments. We have data. We have the cumulative knowledge of thousands of years. Yet even with all of this, the emotional impact would be the same. Humans would gather outside at night, staring upward, feeling the same awe and fear that our ancestors felt. Children would ask questions. Elders would remember old stories. Artists would paint the glowing sky. And once again, humanity would be unified by something larger than itself, a presence that had shaped our world long before we understood it. This is the quiet power of the visitor. It is not a destroyer. It is not a savior. It is simply a reminder that we are part of a cosmos filled with rhythms far older than our species. Rhythms that continue whether we recognize them or not, somewhere. In the cold depths beyond the known planets, the visitor continues its slow journey inward. It has made this journey countless times. It will make it countless more. It is indifferent to our stories, yet it has shaped them all the same. And as you listen now, You are part of that long chain of memory, carrying forward a story that has traveled through ages of fear and ages of wonder, through temples and telescopes, through myths and mathematics. The story continues. And as the story continues to unfold, you may begin to notice that humanity's fascination with the heavens has always been an echo of something older, something instinctive, a pull not unlike gravity itself. We are drawn to the sky because, in some silent way, the sky remembers us. Every civilization that ever lifted its eyes upward left behind a mark, a carved stone, a painted symbol, a whispered legend. All these marks form a network of memory across time, a map not of continents but of experiences. And the visitor, with its long, wandering orbit, sits at the center of that map like a slow heartbeat. Imagine now an ancient valley surrounded by mountains, so high their peaks disappear into the clouds. In this valley stands a stone circle older than any written language. Each stone is tall, weathered, and aligned with a precision that surprises modern researchers. They discover that the stones track solstices, equinoxes, and star risings with extraordinary accuracy. But there is one alignment that does not match any known celestial event. One stone points toward the horizon where no star should ever rise. Its purpose is a mystery until an inscription is found, faint and worn by time. It speaks of a burning traveler, a long-forgotten star, a second dawn. The meaning becomes clear. The stone was not aligned to the known heavens. But to the visitor, this realization sends ripples through both archaeology and astronomy. If such ancient people aligned monuments to the visitor, then its previous passing must have been an event of extraordinary importance, extraordinary enough to shape architecture, religion, and the very way humans understood time. It becomes difficult to dismiss myths as fantasy when they influence the design of structures still standing after thousands of years. Now, picture a secluded monastery perched on a mountainside during the late medieval period. Inside, monks copy ancient manuscripts by candlelight, preserving knowledge almost lost to war and famine. One monk flips through a damaged scroll written in a script centuries older than his own. The scroll describes a roaring sky and a crimson lamp of the gods. He does not understand the astronomy behind it, but he is moved by the power of the words. He copies the tale faithfully, believing it to be a metaphor for spiritual renewal. He has no idea that the scroll he is transcribing contains one of the last honest descriptions of a celestial event humanity would eventually forget. His work, Kadi, From Library to Library, eventually lands in the hands of modern researchers who realize the scroll's description matches geological data of an ancient atmospheric disturbance. Once again, the past speaks more truthfully than expected. And this is the thread that connects everyone who has ever looked upward. The idea that the sky holds secrets worth preserving, even if their meanings fade across generations. Each watcher adds a fragment to the story. And even fragments lost in fire or buried under empires eventually resurface in unexpected places. Sometimes a clue appears as a line of poetry. Sometimes as a strange symbol on pottery. Sometimes as a star map etched into bone. All these clues point back to cycles, cycles of climate, cycles of catastrophe, cycles of celestial movement. And among those cycles, the visitor stands like a ghost in the data, present but elusive, shaping but unseen. Imagine, too, the possibility that ancient cultures understood these cycles better than we assume. They were not primitive. They were observant. Their memories were not stored on servers, but carried in traditions and rituals. When they warned of the time when fire returns or the season of double lights, they were not speaking only in metaphor. They were remembering, in the only language they had, the last time the visitor approached. If humanity experiences another cycle within our own era, it would not come as a sudden disaster. It would begin the same way ancient cycles began, slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly. A slight shift in the outer planets. Minor anomalies in orbital paths. A faint glow detected by infrared telescopes. Dust clouds forming at the edge of the heliosphere. Weather patterns becoming subtly unpredictable. Nothing dramatic at first. Just a sense that something is stirring in the deep. And as that stirring grows, the people closest to the truth would not be kings or rulers, but scientists, the new watchers. They would notice changes in data long before the public notices changes in the sky. They would debate quietly, cautious of panic. They would inform governments who would navigate the delicate balance between disclosure and stability. And all the while, the visitor would move steadily inward, indifferent to debates, politics, or human concern. Yet even if the visitor came near again, modern humanity would not face it with fear alone. For the first time in history, we would have the ability to observe it with clarity, telescopes, satellites, probes. We would measure its mass, analyze its composition, simulate its orbit. We would not kneel in fear or hide its existence. We would seek to understand it. And perhaps, in doing so, we would restore the knowledge the ancients labored so hard to preserve. This is the quiet miracle of human progress. What once terrorized becomes something we yearn to comprehend. What once shook empires now fuels scientific curiosity. The visitor is no longer a sign of doom, but a reminder of the vast, mysterious beauty of the universe we inhabit. Even now, as you listen in the stillness of night, you can feel the weight of that mystery, a sense that humanity is part of something cosmic and ancient, something that has been unfolding long before the first cities rose and will continue long after our own era has passed. And perhaps, somewhere out in the silent dark, the visitor drifts onward, carrying with it the unspoken history of ages, waiting for the moment when its slow arc brings it once again into the realm of human eyes. And as we drift further into the quiet of this unfolding tale, you may begin to sense something unexpected taking shape, an awareness that the visitor is not merely an ancient object, not merely a cycle, not merely a myth, but a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest fears, oldest memories, and strongest instincts. A mirror reminding us how small we are, and yet how endlessly curious. For every time the visitor's glow touched the earth, it forced people to confront truths they were not prepared to face, that the universe is vast, that change is inevitable, and that knowledge can be both a burden and a gift. Imagine now the traveler's long, cold path through space. It drifts through regions where sunlight is only a whisper, where dust clouds move like frozen rivers. It passes remnants of ancient collisions, fragments of worlds that existed before Earth formed. It glides through curtains of cosmic particles untouched by human eyes. In these far reaches, time loses meaning. Thousands of years blur into a single moment. The visitor neither hurries nor delays. It moves with the slow certainty of a force older than mountains, older than oceans, older even than life on Earth. Yet, despite this unimaginable scale, humanity has managed to record its presence, engrave its memory, fear its approach, and then forget it, only to remember again. This cycle of remembering and forgetting is one of the greatest mysteries in our history. How does a story so profound vanish, only to reappear in fragments scattered across continents? Perhaps because the truth was too heavy for rulers to bear. Perhaps because survival demanded forgetfulness. Or perhaps because some truths are meant to be rediscovered only when humanity is ready. Picture a scholar in the late Renaissance studying ancient manuscripts. Candlelight flickers on his face as he traces lines describing a fiery sphere whose passing brought a darkness at noon. He assumes it is metaphorical, a poetic invention. He copies the text faithfully, filing it away with other curiosities. He does not know that hundreds of years later, satellites will measure a layer of atmospheric dust that corresponds precisely to the era described in his manuscript. The scholar preserves a truth he does not understand, becoming part of a chain of memory that stretches back to the first scribes who carved warnings into clay. This is how humanity keeps its secrets safe, not through perfect record keeping, but through repetition. When enough people tell the same story across enough generations, it becomes impossible to erase completely. Even kings, with their power to burn libraries and silence witnesses, cannot erase a story whispered in lullabies, carved in stones, sung in rituals, and hidden in metaphors. The visitor survived not because the ancients wanted it to, but because the universe itself imprinted the memory into the world. And now imagine the visitor at the midpoint of its long orbit, far beyond the planets, drifting through regions where even starlight cannot reach. It is nothing but a dark shape against a darker background. No glow, no movement visible to the human eye. No hint of the influence it once had. But gravity remembers. Gravity pulls at distant objects, shaping their paths in ways too subtle for ancient astronomers to calculate, but clear to modern researchers analyzing data. Even in its silence, the visitor leaves fingerprints. It is this silent influence that first drew the attention of modern scientists. Small icy bodies at the edge of the solar system move in ways that cannot be explained by the known planets. Their orbits cluster in strange patterns, as if responding to the pull of something massive and unseen. The data is incomplete, but it whispers of a hidden world, a world that might be the very same visitor the ancients once feared and revered. Imagine the moment when a modern astronomer, studying a faint set of numbers on a screen, realizes that the anomalies point to a single source, a distant, wandering planet. The realization would not be accompanied by dramatic music or flashing lights, but by a quiet intake of breath, a tightening of the chest, a sense of connection across thousands of years. In that moment, the astronomer joins the lineage of ancient watchers. He becomes the new scribe. It's the new keeper of a story much older than humanity's scientific age. And as the visitor continues its slow, silent return toward the inner solar system, modern technology prepares for the day its faint glow can finally be observed directly. Telescopes will search for its heat signature. Probes may be launched to study it. Data will flow, not in clay symbols, but in digital streams. And when the world sees images of the visitor, cold, dark, massive, ancient, something deep within humanity will stir. Not fear, not panic, but recognition, a feeling that we have seen this before, in stories and carvings and myths. That feeling will not come from science alone, but from memory. A memory passed through countless generations. A memory the Earth itself has carried, waiting for us to rediscover. And here is the quiet beauty of it all. The visitor does not threaten us. It teaches us. It humbles us. It reminds us that history is not simply what we write in books, but what we live through in cycles far greater than any individual lifespan. It reminds us that ancient voices still echo across time, waiting for the moment when someone will listen with both mind and heart. The visitor continues its path. Humanity continues its search. And through this silent dance, the universe reveals a truth the ancients always felt but could never articulate fully. That we are not separate from the cosmos, but shaped by it, moved by it, remembered by it. Somewhere out there, beyond the last reach of sunlight, the visitor drifts toward us once more. Slow, eternal, indifferent, yet profoundly connected to the story of our world. And perhaps, when it returns again, we will greet it not with fear, but with understanding. And now, as we arrive at the final stretch of this long journey through forgotten epochs and drifting worlds, let your mind settle into a gentle stillness, as if the universe itself has paused to breathe with you. We have walked through ruins, read forgotten inscriptions, listened to the whispers of scribes long gone, followed the visitor across ages, and traced the fingerprints it left upon the earth. And in all these moments, one truth has emerged quietly. almost shyly, like a star revealing itself on a cloudy night. That humanity's story is not just written in soil and stone, but in sky and silence, in memory and myth. In fear and discovery, imagine now a quiet plain just before dawn. The horizon is a soft shade of blue, and a thin mist curls above the grass. A lone traveler stands beneath the sky, staring upward as stars fade into morning light. He does not know the science of orbits or the language of astronomy. He does not know the shape of the visitor, or its mass, or its gravitational influence. But he knows the stories his grandmother told him. Stories of a red light that came long ago. Stories of winds that smelled of distant deserts. Stories of nights as bright as day. He does not fear these stories. He carries them the way people carry lullabies, as something familiar, something ancient, something meant to survive. The sky brightens. The traveler lowers his eyes and walks on, but the memory remains with him. And that is how humanity persists. Not through perfect records or unbroken traditions, but through fragments carried quietly across generations, waiting for the right moment to be understood. Imagine the visitor's path through deep time. As it drifts inward, the sun warms its surface slightly, awakening dormant features. Dust cascades off its frozen ridges. Its glow, once invisible, begins to sharpen. Not enough to be seen by human eyes yet, but enough for instruments to detect a faint signature. Telescopes trained on the dark pick up a whisper of movement. A pattern emerges in the data, slow, deliberate, undeniable. Scientists gather around screens in silent anticipation, watching as the visitor reveals itself pixel by pixel. For a moment, the room falls into a stillness that feels sacred. They are not discovering something new. They are rediscovering something humanity once knew intimately. Long ago, when we lived closer to the rhythms of nature, when the sky was our clock, our scripture, our guardian, the visitor moves with an ancient grace, not caring for our excitement or our fear. It has crossed the boundaries of time and culture, influencing civilizations without ever intending to. It has been worshipped, feared, erased, remembered, forgotten, rediscovered. It is the silent traveler in our myths, the fiery omen in our stories, the red wanderer in our sky maps. It is the thread that ties together the shepherd, the monk, the astronomer, the king, the storyteller, all of them gazing upward, searching for meaning. And if one day the visitor becomes visible again, a faint glow on the horizon, brighter each night, humanity will gather just as our ancestors did. People will stand on balconies, on rooftops, in open fields, looking upward in wonder. Some will feel fear, some awe, some curiosity. Children will ask questions. Elders will tell stories they didn't even know they remembered. The world will feel united, not by borders or beliefs, but by shared astonishment at the vastness of the cosmos. Perhaps that is the visitor's greatest gift. Not chaos, not catastrophe, but perspective, a reminder that the universe is immense and ancient, and that we are part of something beautiful and mysterious beyond imagination. A reminder that our differences shrink in the presence of the infinite. A reminder that knowledge is a torch passed from one generation to another. A light that grows brighter even when shadows threaten to extinguish it, and as the visitor completes its long arc around the sun and begins its retreat once more into the cold outer darkness. Humanity will watch it fade, knowing it will return again someday in a future beyond our years. It will return when new civilizations rise and new watchers look upward with fresh eyes. It will return when the world has changed beyond recognition. It will return because that is its nature, to move in cycles through a universe that is always in motion, and humanity, still here, will remember. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough for the story to survive. For stories, like planets, have their own orbits. They drift through time, disappearing for centuries, reappearing when needed. circling back into our lives as quietly as a whisper carried by the wind. And tonight, as you listen in the hush between breaths, you realize that you are now part of this ancient cycle of remembering. You carry it with you the way the ancients carried it. You understand something that cannot be written easily or measured precisely, that we live in a universe where silence speaks louder than words, and where forgotten worlds drift just beyond the edge of our sight, waiting for the moment when their long shadow crosses our sky again. Welcome to the deep memory of the cosmos. Welcome to the story humanity has been trying to remember since the beginning. Welcome to Dreams of History.